One of the greatest influences on my life, and perhaps one of the greatest witnesses to truth and the power of Jesus Christ, was a man called Athanasius Yeshue. He was a bishop in the Syrian Orthodox Church, starting at age 32, and lived until his 80s. He ended his life at the end of the 20th century after a long and vigorous and quite amazing career. You see, he was a young bishop, age 32, the minimum age for a bishop, when he was appointed the Bishop of Jerusalem. At that time, some Bedouin tribesmen found some dusty old scrolls and jars in caves just outside the Dead Sea. They brought them into Jerusalem and shopped them around to different people to raise some money for themselves. One of the scrolls they were actually cutting up into small pieces. They knocked on the door of St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem, one of our Syrian Orthodox monasteries, and one of the monks came to the door and told the people to go away. When Bishop Samuel heard about these visitors, he got quite angry at the monks and demanded that they chase down this visitor with the scrolls. They came back with this visitor, and Bishop Samuel negotiated with a man called Kondo, and eventually settled upon a price for $125, and he bought 5 dusty scrolls. Bishop Samuel took them to various institutions around Jerusalem, and one of the places was the French Institute. Dr. Trevor there, to this day and during his lifetime, considers this one of the greatest mistakes of his life. He rejected the scrolls and considered them inauthentic. Finally, Bishop Samuel took a small piece of one of the scrolls and sent it off to Harvard University. They authenticated one of the scrolls as being 2,000 years old. Suddenly, the world exploded with the news that ancient scrolls, 800 years older than any other previous record, testifying to the authenticity of the Bible and a few other things. And Bishop Samuel became one of the most famous men in the world. They asked him, "What shall we name these scrolls? What name do you want to give them?" He finally settled upon the Dead Sea Scrolls. And suddenly his face and his image was on the front of Time magazine, Newsweek, many of the famous periodicals all over the world. I knew about this man only from pictures in a book. I knew about this man only from hearing about him in my seminary classes and university classes. In the early 1980s, I was in Jerusalem looking for ancient manuscripts myself. I was following in the footsteps of one of my professors, Dr. Arthur Vubis, who was famous for finding over 200,000 pages of material in the language of Jesus, Syriac or Aramaic. It was my passion to contribute to this multi-generational effort. I had spent weeks going to different monasteries and places where I had heard by rumor and suggestion there might be a manuscript available or for sale. The Greek monastery in Jerusalem, I had visited it many times. Each time they would charge me money for entering the monastery and demand that I pay a gift, bakshish, for the privilege of talking to one of the bishops. Each time I would return, I would go through the same process again and be out a small bit of money. The University of Chicago had given me money for what we call bakshish, bribe giving. And finally, after a number of weeks, I was out of money. They had finally drained all the milk from me. So I was back near the monastery, and I saw the librarian near the door. I ran across the street and slipped inside the monastery and followed the librarian to his library, the library for the Greek monastery. He was telling me I couldn't come in because they were putting medicine on the books. Finally, I was able to convince him, and I just needed to look at some of the manuscripts. And sure enough, when I got in, I found a few manuscripts, many with pages torn out, improperly cared for. And it was sad to see the state that these precious materials were in. I reported on this to the American Association of Scholars back in Seattle, Washington. So after this failed effort, I was sitting in a small courtyard near the Damascus Gate there in Jerusalem, feeling very sorry for myself. And I literally prayed to God and said, why all these years of study? Why all these long journeys into the Middle East and places around the world? Why all this time spent on studying the language of Jesus, only to end up on the edge of oblivion? I felt I had failed. And finally, I realized that my hands were so full of my own projects, my own dreams and ambitions. I finally let go of everything that was on my bucket list. I wanted nothing more. And suddenly, God filled my hands with one of the greatest treasures of my life, which was friendship with a man who pulled up in a limousine. He got out. He was dressed in flowing black robes and a strange-looking hat, and I recognized him. I recognized him from pictures in a book. I ran across the street and I stretched out my hand and I said, "Hello, Bishop Samuel." He looked at me and he said, "Oh, I know you." And I said, "How do you know me?" "We've never met." He said, "Oh, you once wrote me a letter in Syriac. Somebody like you never has done that." And he laughed. From that moment on, we became great friends. He invited me back the next day, and I was allowed inside St. Mark's Monastery, and I was taken up to meet Bishop Yeshue. And I'll never forget it. After talking to Bishop Samuel said, "This is my friend from America." Now remember, he had only just met me. But Bishop Samuel commanded Bishop Yeshue, "Do whatever he asks." And I'll never forget that Bishop Yeshue pulled out a key from his belt, and he walked over to a wall that had been recently renovated by French archaeologists that were investigating the monastery. A wall had been taken down, and they said something has been found behind it. He opened the door to which this key belonged, and inside this room were over 600 manuscripts, many over 1,000 years old. I was in what was the equivalent academically of Solomon's Mines. I entered, and for the next few weeks I microfilmed thousands of pages of manuscripts. Some of them had never been seen by the Western world before. After 3 weeks, I returned to the University of Chicago and delivered 20,000 pages of material. It made my career, it made my life. All this because I let go and let God. And I can tell you now, if you empty your hands and your heart of ambition, if you let go of all the selfish things you've been holding on to, God will fill them with precious jewels that you cannot even imagine. My theme and my life has been guided by this principle: let go and let God.